Okay. Okay, great. Welcome to the December Kelsey Museum Virtual Flash Talk. Our speaker today is Leah Bernardo-Ciddio. She is a PhD candidate in classical art and archaeology here at the University of Michigan. And her talk today is entitled Investigating the Production Choices of Ancient Potters in Southeast Italy and Albania. And I just want to welcome Leah and turn it over to her. Thank you.
Thanks for that introduction, Stephanie. I really appreciate it. I'm gonna hopefully share my screen and hope that it works the way I want it to. Okay, and if I do slideshow, is everyone seeing that okay? Maybe if I can get a nod. Okay, thank you so much. All right, and hopefully you can all hear me clearly. I'm really excited to be presenting this flash talk. It's my first one, so I'm excited to share some of the research I've been doing on fine pottery in the Adriatic area that dates to the 9th through 6th centuries BCE. Today I'll discuss a case study that's situated in the South Adriatic, specifically between the Italian region of Puglia on the Western Adriatic coast. So that's, hopefully you can see my cursor, but that's just down here. Puglia is really long. And on Albania on the Eastern Adriatic coast, which is just peeking out here through the side of the map. This case study uses geometric matte painted pottery, 2 examples of which you see here at the top, which are not to scale, but they're just here so you can see some examples, to explore different interactions in this area during this time. The Salento Middle Geometric style of the 8th century mostly comprised shapes and motifs that had clear precedent in earlier traditions and earlier ceramic styles, and technical features are said to have remained relatively consistent between these 2 periods. That is, the forming method of the vessels remained relatively the same. However, while most of the vessels of the period were morphologically similar, so similar in shape to those being produced earlier, some local potters began to produce 2 forms that have few contemporary or preceding parallels in the matte painted class, and they also adopted some new motifs. So those motifs are here, and then the shapes are also shown here. So this one here, this little one-handled cup, that's my hand there, was a new shape in the period with this tiny little, what we call a wishbone handle, and then this shape here, this 2-handled vessel, both of which were probably used for the consumption and serving of wine. I became interested in these changes, so the appearance of new shapes and the adoption of new motifs, which kind of are located in the 8th, 7th century. And I was really interested in the previous explanations that point out the similarities between these new shapes and motifs and those from the handmade pottery from Southeast Albania, some examples of which I provided you. So these are some Albanian vessels here. These are all museum images. But that's what these are. And these would have been produced by the prehistoric people of Albania who are known as the Illyrians. One explanation that was offered for links between these regional productions was a proposed migration of people from Illyria, which is mostly present-day Albania, but also there's some kind of expansion and existence outside of the modern nation of Albania. And so an explanation was people had migrated, and they brought vessels with them because we do have imports from this area at this time at the same sites, and that they also continued to produce matte painted pottery once they settled in Italy. So the matte painted pottery in Salento, which reflects new shapes and new motifs, is taken as one of the multiple signs of significant migration from Albania to Italy during the Iron Age. And this is a process sometimes called the Illyrianization of this part of Italy. These hypotheses that were first put forward in the 80s with some historical context, but in the 80s is when they were really starting to talk about this pottery as an indicator, were developed based on just what the pottery looked like at a relatively superficial level. So we're looking at motifs and we're looking at shape. Oops, my battery is running low. Okay, we're gonna, when I get a chance to pause, I will plug it in somewhere. Hold on a second. Shira, do you know where I can plug it in? I have an assistant with me, thank goodness. I'll continue. This focused on the shapes of the vessels and the specific decorations painted on their surfaces. However, archaeologists now have access to multiple different methodologies that can help us examine the sort of building blocks of pottery in an attempt to detect changes in the makeup of producer communities in a more systematic and scientific way. Craftspeople, so that's people who produce pottery, but also metals, textiles, etc., are often ignored as the agents of material culture change. So usually when we talk about material culture change, we tend to focus a lot on consumers. Hold on a second. I'm just going to take a second to plug in my computer. This is probably a first for the Flash Talks. Thank you. So we're usually talking about consumers when we talk about material culture change, but we really should actually be looking at the producers sometimes, especially when we're talking about things like pottery. Understanding the habits of potters is important because craftspeople usually tend to replicate the methods they learned as apprentices in their home communities. Craftspeople are thus part of a larger community of practice that's united by a shared knowledge acquired through their similar learning experiences, and thus also united by similar habits and technical choices in the context of producing objects. Changes in the production trends of a specific place sometimes suggest new knowledge or foreign craftspeople or new knowledge brought by foreign craftspeople in the community, because production methods are not really able to be gleaned or imitated from an imported pot. So even if there's something that they like a new shape, they like a new motif, they're going to tend to produce it the same way they produce their other local pottery, because if a pot is imported and you have no contact with the potter who made it, you cannot tell, or an ancient potter cannot tell how that was made. So if you analyzed it, it would tend to be produced the same way as the rest of their local pottery. What this means is that potters are likely to use similar combinations of clays and raw resources as they are used to, because they learn to prefer those materials for both practical and cultural reasons. They also tend, and practical means like, certain materials just are preferable because they lend specific qualities to vessels. So they might be stronger, they might be able to withstand thermal shock, etc. They also tend to follow specific steps in the processing of those materials when they're going about the actual production process, because that's just the way in which they learned to make pottery. These tend to be very conservative production processes. These are methods and gestures that become habitual over time through being passed across generations, and also for an individual potter because it was kind of ingrained in them during their training process. And so potters who migrate will typically bring that knowledge and those behaviors to them into a new locus. So if potters are migrating, then when they migrate and settle, they're going to actually be producing in a very similar way for the most part to how they did before they left. I set out to explore the actual sign of the production of the Salento middle geometric vessels and also of the contemporary Albanian matte painted vessels to try to determine whether we did have in this period an influx of potters from Albania into the Salentine communities in Southeast Italy. I spent 3 months in Italy and 1 month in Albania examining matte painted pottery from multiple sites in both countries. And I documented various physical signs of the way local potters had been forming and finishing their pottery. This project required my establishing what the common practices were for potters in both areas, what steps they typically took and in what order, what materials they used, and how they put everything together. This involved taking high quality photos, often with a macro lens, and often as well with the aid of raking light, which you can see in this little animation here that this is kind of the same piece of pottery, and you can see that I was moving the light around to capture different angles to see the production traces from different relief, basically, to see really tiny details. These are pretty large details, but even the smallest were pretty obvious once I shut off the lights and used this little handheld handheld flashlight. So what exactly was I looking for when I was taking these photos? I was looking really for any signs of production. I paid really close attention to the sort of relief and topography of the internal and external walls of each vessel, any crevices or depressions, any traces of the clay being smoothed or brushed or compressed, and any streaks or lines on the surfaces. This can be done in a number of, and is especially interested in documenting evidence for the different methods of building up the vessel out of clay. And there's many different ways to do this. Sometimes potters would pinch clay to make it into shape. You can, well, not here actually, this is very rare here, but I'll get to that in a minute. But potters might be able to pinch clay to form pots. They can put slabs together and slab build their pottery. They can make clay coils, so they make like a little snake of clay and kind of spiral them upwards to make the walls of the pottery, or they can use a potter's wheel. So that's the thing that we often think about when we think about pottery, is the actual like wheel throwing a vessel and using the energy from that rotation to pull the clay up and thin it out. The latter two methods, so coil building and wheel throwing, or any use of the wheel, can be combined in various configurations. The wheel can also be used to assist the smoothing of coils, so they can bring the kind of coils together in kind of layering them up and then using the wheel to help them smooth it out. This can create some challenges for us who are examining production, because the actual action of using the wheel to start smoothing the coils means that sometimes the traces of coiling can be obliterated. But this kind of study can kind of help determine what's going on, because on the inside of these vessels, you can sometimes see the actual coil joins or imperfect joins too when they haven't joined it completely. So even though it might look completely smooth through the aid of the wheel, we can still determine whether they were coiling first. And here's just a couple of more images of pottery I looked at. This is a nice little wheel. You can see the traces of wheel use through these little this thing we call reeling. It's striations from kind of pulling the clay upwards on the wheel. This method is an excellent way to glean information about the production of vessels, especially during a preliminary stage that can be followed by detailed analyses. So I'm still at the preliminary stage of getting a good overview of this pottery before I can go on and use other methodologies to do some more targeted examination. These kind of other methodologies can include X-ray analysis, which you can see here, some examples of pots that have been put in an X-ray machine, petrographic analysis, or other chemical analyses. Petrography can help us analyze the material and structural components of a clay body. A sample from a pot is typically ground down really flat to be mounted on a slide, which can then be viewed through a microscope. And ceramic petrography can especially help archaeologists identify the specific combinations of materials and resources that potters put in the clay to adjust its texture, make it workable, or to have certain characteristics, as I mentioned, like changing in color or ability to withstand thermal shock. Chemical analysis can involve various methodologies that help us determine the chemical and elemental makeup of the clay and all the other tempers and other things that have been put into that fabric. And that can help us identify where in the landscape potters have sourced their material, as long as you also can sample some material from nearby. And this is something that ceramic specialists do fairly frequently, which is kind of fun to go look for clay near a site. X-radiography, which I'm really interested in, involves X-raying vessels to establish how pots were built, based primarily on the arrangement and orientation of all the particles and voids and organic fragments that become visible once you actually X-ray them. I've identified some that I'd really like to put in an X-ray machine one day, and it's nice because it's a non-destructive and fairly cheap method to examine the construction of vessels. So that's why I'm very excited about this, because it'll help verify some of the conclusions I've made about the way specific vessels have been constructed, whether it's wheel thrown or wheel smoothed, or any one of these combinations of coiling and wheel use. I didn't have the resources, budget, or permissions to take large enough samples to bring back and put onto, turn into thin sections to do petrographic analysis, but I was able to use a handheld digital microscope, which is significantly cheaper than an actual electron microscopes, I can't remember what they're called now, but actual microscopes, to take some high magnification images of some of the fabrics of this pottery, both in Italy and Albania. I wish I could have taken everything on fresh breaks, but not everything had fresh breaks, and I didn't have permission to break things either, which sometimes happens, unfortunately. But it's still really good because it gives you a better idea of what the fabric really looks like and what these component parts are. And these will be really useful because there is some work that's already been done, at least in Salento, on the different fabric groups that existed in the region at this time. So it'll be helpful for essentially identifying which vessels correspond to which fabric group, and then determining within that fabric group whether there's a variation in production style. So that actually can give us some understanding of how people's behaviors about how they sort of adjust the clay recipe and how that relates to how they produce the pottery too. So we could actually have multiple overlapping communities of practice at each site and also across the region. So it's going to be interesting to put these two methodologies together at some point. When it will be done, I'm not entirely sure, but hopefully by next June when I'm done the dissertation. I'm still working on sorting through all my data that I collected. It's taking a little bit of time to do it, but it will be done. I did notice some initial patterns in the work I've done so far, though, and I've put them up here on the slide. It was really interesting seeing that both in Italy and in what is now Albania, contemporary potters were actually using very similar methods of either hand building or coiling with fairly limited incorporation at the wheel. There are some exceptions, like at the site of Tren in Albania, the wheel is like really popular for a really short period of time, but only maybe amongst one potter, two potters. It never supplants hand making or like wheel smoothing. So wheel throwing, which involves the pulling up of clay upwards using that sort of rotational energy I mentioned, was still rare. Although there's like one period where they're really using it a lot, but it's not everybody, and it never becomes most popular. Actually, it's just there's a lot of it in one period and then they give up. I think maybe they just weren't really interested in this. It wasn't necessary for them to be using that method because they preferred their traditional method. They didn't have to produce this pottery at high enough volume for it to be necessary. So there are cultural reasons to stick to a previous technology. Not everybody is invested in, adopting new methods. So they're using similar methods, but there were noticeable differences I found in approaches to surface treatment and the preferred tools that they were using, and also the stages of dryness at which they started to kind of take on the next step for building or adjusting this vessel. And I put them up here just because I don't want to end up describing what's already on my slide because it'd be boring, but different types of tools, pointy tools versus flat tools, small and smooth tools versus like kind of big cloth tools, etc. And as I mentioned, I'm probably going to follow up on some of my initial observations with other methodologies, so X radiography, and I'd love to do some chemical analysis as well to kind of understand where people were sourcing their materials. As for what it means, however, I'm leaning toward the conclusion that in fact, so if there were potters migrating to Italy, there were not a lot of them, and certainly not enough to be responsible for these changes that I discussed, so that not enough people were migrating to account for the change in shape and motif. So we have to start thinking about other things, which it actually might just be a reaction to an increase in exchange in this area and at this time. And we do see that in assemblages of different material classes. So we do see a higher exchange of metal objects like pins and women's ornaments at this time. It doesn't mean that there was no migration, though. Of course, it's not that it was just all exchange. It just means that maybe the people who were migrating were not really integrating we're not totally integrating with other people who were producing this pottery at this time. Or if they did produce pottery locally, they produced very little, or it could also be that when they came over, they did in fact adapt to local practice, which is also possible. It's not always exclusive that it's not exclusively the case that people will always stick to their old habits. If there are maybe 1 or 2 people of 50 who are producing pottery, they might actually adjust to local practice. And that's it. I have a list of organizations that I have to thank, and I also want to thank the Kelsey for putting on these flash talks and giving us the opportunity to discuss our work.
Thank you so much, Leah. That was incredibly fascinating and interesting. And I now want to open up the Flash Talk to you, our audience, to ask questions of Leah and her research. So feel free to unmute yourselves and go ahead and ask a question, or if you want to put it in the chat and then I can read it out to Leah.
Great presentation.
Thank you.
I guess I have a question. I'll go ahead and start. So if you had the money, like you said, you didn't have the specific funding for utilizing kind of the tools that you wanted to, but what would the findings be if you had that funding? What did you hope to achieve?
Yeah, so thank you. That's a great question. I should be like fully honest. It's not just about not having funding, but it's also that like this was my first time actually touching the pottery. So it's kind of a necessary to get a good overview before you can target specific things for sampling, because there's hundreds, actually thousands of these sherds, and you can't just bring them all and say, hey, I have no idea what this might show. But I think it would have allowed for kind of better understanding of the methods of forming these vessels, because using just like, well, not just my own eyes, but essentially, yes, because I'm using a macro lens to get really close, and I'm using like I have a little, we call them like, I don't know, jewelry loop lenses to help get really close, but it's still like macroscopic. That can only go so far, especially because the finishing processes of these vessels kind of remove the traces of what the internal structure is. So doing X radiography, for example, would have kind of verified or disproven some of the kind of identifications I made, that this is made originally with coils that were then pinched at the seams to kind of join them, and then just smoothed upward with the wheel. Or there are multiple different combinations that can be used between the coiling and the wheel. So I'm also trying to determine which of those happen, and the X radiography could really help with that. For the petrography, that'll be really interesting to do in the future, and I haven't thought too much about it, but I am really curious about the fabric groups, because the work that had been done on that already was done about 17 years ago now, actually, maybe even longer, almost 20 actually. And that was done, I'm not actually sure how that was done. I don't know if that person who published that was actually using a microscope for it. So using sort of optical microscopy could really help with figuring out, okay, like what are these potters actually putting into the clay. And that'll be interesting as well, because I really do want to try to identify whether there are multiple habits in the area. So whether there are people who use specific fabrics and tend to different fabrics, but rather producing all similarly. And this would be interesting because there are multiple fabrics present in Salento, that we know for sure, but I'll be curious to see whether this period sees kind of a new fabric group showing up. So basically new people produce, like using different things to put in their clay, and whether this corresponds to something in Albania. So that would be helpful too. I don't know what the conclusion would be because it's hard to predict, but that would be really interesting too. And as for chemical analysis, it can kind of help to see, like, are there multiple groups that are maybe producing things differently with different methods, but they're sharing resources, which is also common, something common, like either they're sharing or they're just exploiting the similar resource in their landscape or a specific clay source.
Thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We have a question in the chat actually that I'll read out to you from Linda Kimmel. When you use the handheld microscope, did it need to be on break areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So yes, preferably yes. And ideally it will be fresh breaks, because when you have a break that's not fresh, it's usually like quite dirty, or, you know, it's been kind of not eroded, but like kind of softened. I don't know if eroded is the right word, but it's kind of disintegrated a bit. It's deteriorated. So you can't really get a good idea of the shape of some of the types of temper that have been put in. And sometimes you just can't see it because it's dirty. And sometimes when I had like a break that wasn't fresh, because I wasn't able to take fresh breaks, I was trying to use, they gave me a little toothbrush and like a scalpel to try to clean it off, but they wouldn't let me break anything off. So that was really difficult. And often I ended up taking images just of surfaces, areas of surfaces that were as kind of clean as possible, just for my own record. But it's not going to be as good as having a fresh break. And sometimes I did have fresh breaks, not that I took, but that like someone else broke something fairly recently in the storerooms. And so I was able to take an image of that. But ideally I would be able to take fresh breaks. And that's what I hope I'll be able to do. I'm starting, I'll be on a project that's just starting, and it spends some time in Salento, this southeastern part of Italy, and some time in northern Albania. And there I will be able to break whatever I want. So it'll be a good opportunity to get images from fresh breaks.
Great, thank you. And then I don't know if you saw, Linda said, thanks, that's really interesting.
Thank you. It's a good question.
So any other questions?
If anyone has other questions like that you think of later, I'll put my email address in the chat, so you can also send me an email whenever you want.
Let's see. So that's great. You can follow up with Leah. Does anyone else have any other questions or comments that they would like to contribute? We have a thanks so much. This was a great presentation.
Thank you.
Well, as always, I want to thank everyone for attending today, and just remind everyone that our Flash Talks take place on the first Friday of every month. So feel free to look at the Kelsey Museum's website for our next Flash Talk. And let's see, it looks like I see a hand raised. Mikhail, or go ahead.
I think it's applause.
Oh, it's applause, I'm sorry. Well, thank you so much. And thank you all for joining today. And feel free to check the Kelsey website for more of our public programming in the future. And I just want to thank Leah again today for her presentation. So if there's no further questions or anything, I will we'll go ahead and end this program. But as always, feel free to email Leah with any further questions or comments. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.